accounting concepts. Discuss accounting concepts. We are running from list and discuss. Okay, if you like it to say, what are accounting concepts? Application.
All these are lower order thinking skills. And in authentic assessment, you should go higher. Students should be able to apply those concepts.
So in
Look
that
at
case,
the Pythagoras theorem. He didn't say he was running away from saying state Pythagoras theorem because it would be too basic. So he went to the application. And that is what we are looking at now. That is what the whole China university system is all about. That students should, graduates should be able to apply the skills to a working environment. Not that you will read your communication skills or whatever. Then when you go for interview, then you don't know what you're talking about. So those lists and whatever, they can read the concept. But can they work in the bank? Can they work in the bank? Yes. Just by describing concepts?
Okay, no.
So they should be able to use those
question that we need to that.
So calm down, take your 5 minutes and go over it again.
Oh, yeah, let me just see this.
No, why you are thinking about it? Let us.
Let another person there. So that you don't come back again.
Interview.
I have another question.
In accounting, you could have worked together. Okay, let's see the scenario 2.
Okay. The standard is for the student to prepare a trial, a profit and loss account. Should be able to prepare a P&L account, profits and loss account.
Profit and loss account.
Yes. So the authentic task is for them to identify the steps involved in preparing the profits and loss account. Then the criteria is that the students are expected to state or to identify the sales figure, that's one. Then to identify the elements of cost of goods available for sale. Should be also the next one is to identify the gross profit figure. Then identify the components of expenses. Then finally, the profit figure. So that's the criteria. So for the rubric, for a student that is able to identify all of these figures and the components of each head, will get a yes and no. If a student is able to only identify the figures and not identify the components for the head to determine the final figure, we get a yes. For a student that is able to just state or identify the head in preparing the profit and loss account, we get a yes. And for a student that doesn't state any of this, we get a no.
What is your task?
The task is to prepare a profit and loss account.
Ability to identify. Does it lead to ability to do what you have said?
She has just given the task now differently. What she said is so it wasn't a task. You are just the last statement you make now. Okay, put it again as a task.
The last
with
thing
more
you said
confidence.
is task. The first one was
the first one was not a task. We didn't just want to disrupt it. Okay. So go ahead now.
This is standard in
you are going to use again. The second to the last statement now.
That any student that
no.
The heads.
You say the student should prepare profit and loss account.
Should
prepare profit and loss account.
Yes.
Simple.
Identification is one of the steps.
One of the skills that they are supposed to.
Yes.
Okay, what are the other skills?
The other skill, no, the task is to identify the steps.
Okay, wait, you are giving the task now.
Yes.
Can somebody in your group do it?
Not to identify a task.
That identify is still a lower order. It's very simple.
Prepare is the one we are accepting.
Okay. I think the reason why it's like that is because if this figure, if the student cannot identify or
Hey, you are going to marking and whatever now. See, calm down. You are confusing yourself. What do you want students to be able to do?
to prepare a profit and loss
And then tell them to do that. In the question.
prepare a profit and loss
Simple. That is a task now. The other one, you said, okay, I'm not just setting questions. The standard is supposed to help the examiner know exactly what is the objective of the assessment. You are not just assessing for assessing sake. You want your own student to be able to prepare profit and loss account for their organization, for their company when they graduate. That is why you are giving them this question. So now give the question. That is why you said prepare profit and loss account. Simple. That's the task. You now said, okay, what is the criteria you are setting for doing? That's when you now start about this whole issue of all the various components of preparing profit and loss account. Then you now provide a marking scheme based on this, so that you don't indiscriminately uphold the maths. And if you are saying yes, but more in figures, what does that amount to? If it is over 100, then the yes and more, you are now getting to somewhere around 70, 75, 80, 90 marks over 100. Then the yes will now start. The yes part, the yes will come down a bit. Maybe you are looking at maybe very good. That is maybe 65 to 69 or thereabout. Then yes part, then you drop down. So you
what are
pass
the steps
involved? So the step involves and
that
all of
task?
that, then you will not use it to assess it. Do you get it now?
Yes.
Okay.
So he wants to help.
You want to help?
That is the same.
You want to evaluate the criteria,
Yes.
or you want to give the criteria. You are in the same department.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
The task is prepare a profit and loss account. The criteria: 1, students are expected to determine the sales figure. 2, students are expected to determine the expenses. 2. Then 3, students are expected to state the difference between the sales figure and the expenses to determine the profits. So those are the.
No, these are still one criteria because the determination of figure. What are other steps involved in actually doing the assignments?
Because we want to determine the profit or loss.
I know, but what are the steps, as she mentioned before, the steps?
And that's what I'm saying. The first steps is to you have to know the sales figure. Once you know the sales figure, you have to know all the expenses. Sales minus expenses will give us the loss of profits.
Okay.
So that's our
Then
intention.
when you get it there, you post.
Then yes, we post.
But all of that, there's no posting.
Then
So how will it now become a statement?
Then the last
Okay,
one
now
is
that you
post
have
to the
mentioned
respective-
all, give it to us in sequence.
one by one.
In
In
sequence.
sequence, the steps the student
Okay.
will follow before they are able to post.
Okay. Then the first one is the students are expected to determine the sales figure.
The sales figure, the order figure, and the difference. That
Yes, those are the three.
Yes.
Then-
After the determination, what next?
Then you prepare the profit and loss account.
That's the second step. The third step.
Then you post to the respective
So these
file.
are three criteria.
Okay.
So best and more, tell us.
So if the students were able to determine the sales figure, then expenses, then determine the profit and loss and post to the respective accounts.
You have modeled it up again.
Oh, the third steps.
You have three steps involved.
Yes.
From what
so the
I'm
first
learning
one-
from you.
Yes. The first one is determine the sales figure, determine the expenses, then determine the difference between the sales figure and the expense. Which
Okay,
is
those who are
do you
able to
know that-
identify and do what again within that identification.
Do you know that there are people who can identify this
Yes.
but they won't know what to do with that? Are we going
So
to
if
get
they
the same mark?
identify and do something to
Okay,
give them.
if
Are we
the
going to get the
student,
same score?
No,
But
you
you
say
are going to
each
award
of
me
these
one.
three components.
For the one
If you
I'm able
have
to give.
yes and more, yes,
if
yes,
the
more,
student,
and
if
whatever,
the student
for
are,
all the three.
if the students were able to identify all the components, yes and more. If the students were able to
But if the student, let me help you. If the student is able to identify this, identify that, and choose them to do what they need to do,
which is a profit or loss.
yes and more.
Okay.
If the students are able to identify this, identify that, but they don't know what to do with them, yes, but
Okay.
if the students are calling this that and calling the other one that, they are not even.
Okay, let me come up. If the students were able to identify or determine the sales figure, and if the students were able to identify the expenses, then if the students were able to determine the differences between the sales figure and the expenses, yes and more. If the students were able to identify the sales figure and identify the expenses, but were unable to determine the differences between the sales figure and the expenses, yes. And if the students were able to identify the sales figure without identify the expenses and determine the differences between them, no. Yes, but yes, but if the student were unable to determine anything, no.
Okay, thank you.
The second
I think we are getting this small. Are we so continue? Yes. Are we going to end for the
I want two more examples.
Agree.
There's somebody else. So let's listen to her.
Okay.
Yes.
Don't worry.
The question for the adult student is the student should draw the production function curve. So
That's
this
the standard.
no, the standard is to identify, the student should be able to identify all the stages of production. The task is they should draw the production function graph. And the criteria is for you to draw the production function, you must know all the stages of production. So you must identify all the stages of production. On each of the stages, you must know how to fix in some inputs in order to maybe to increase the production or to reduce the production. At the second stage, you should be able to determine the number of inputs to use and the number of outputs. And lastly, for the third stage, you should know when to stop when you are adding more inputs for your production. So the rubric is ability to draw the stages of production without explanation, that is yes. Identify the stages without drawing, yes, but ability to identify the stages, ability to identify all the stages without explanation is yes, but ability to draw and identify is yes, but.
Okay.
I am breathing in.
Break out now.
Let me breathe out. You see, you make that question to look very abstract. Yes. Bring it home. Make it real. Give us one question that will still need us to plot that graph. I'm not in accounting, but I can get some information. I'm not in marketing, but I still got some information. But your own, even the agri is everyday's living, isn't it? But then you made it to be so abstract, as if it is for those going to the moon. Bring it back to earth. Did you not see it that way?
Yeah, she makes she boxed herself into an identification. And then the question is vague The question itself is vague, the criteria is vague, the rubric is even more confusing.
Let us not confuse our
So
students.
just calm down again and then follow accounting, follow nursing, then you can get it. Instead of saying draw production graph, you are saying identify. So draw production graph as a task. I don't know the field quite much, so I don't understand what you're talking about, but it looks like asking them to do something becomes a task. Identification is more of recall. If you see this, will you recognize it? That is okay. What if it's not available? When the student graduates and nothing is put there for students to be able to identify, but the student is not able to come up with it, then the student will become confused. So the issue is, have they reached a stage where they will be able to draw production graph? Did you teach them how to draw production graph? Okay, then ask them to do that. Then it becomes a task. Then it becomes a task. So the process of performing that task is what you are more or less talking about. So calm down, work with your group.
Give us stats. Give us stats.
Maybe you can help us out.
No,
we don't want to help you.
No,
you want
what
you to
we are
help
saying
us.
is give us stats.
Then we can go
that
through
we
it.
make them do what you want them to do.
Look at that. Look at the board. And then use the information there to come up with a standard. Use the information there to come up with a task. Use the information there to come up with a criteria. Then use the information there to create your rubric.
Okay.
If you do this semester, by the time you set the questions, if you see the report of the external examiner, you will know that you have made an improvement. It's not something from the blue or something the white. It's something within our curriculum to use. It's just the nature of the question. What type of question do you chunk up to the student? The road to setting those questions is for you to actually teach the student. Look at the way the questions are. Then you know that you have to actually teach the student. By the time they graduate, they will be wondering what to do at a job place or so. Yes, because they have gone through that. So if it's not something to go in a hurry, take a deep breath before you come back. So that you can go. Yes.
Can we go over it?
And you just answer one person now. Then you come back. And then you. Okay. Let's have it. We'll go back to engineering. No problem. Bring it. Let's do the computer. Oh, are you in engineering? Are you engineering? Yes. I can see the board. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, sirs and mass. The authentic standard is to design and implement a simple circuit. Design and implement a simple circuit. To be able to design and implement a simple circuit. And the authentic tasks, there are two. First one, design a simple circuit. And the second one, implement a simple circuit. So the authentic criteria are the students are expected to create a table of relationship between the inputs and outputs of the circuit. Two, they should be able to express that table of relationship in a mathematical form. Three, they should be able to simplify the expression. By simplification, they maximize the cost, reduce unnecessary expenses. Now, and lastly, to be able to identify the electronic components and transform that expression to the acquired circuit. Those are the criteria. Then the rubrics. If the student is able to create a truth table, building the relationship, truth table relationship between the input and the output, and the student is able to express it in mathematical form, simplify the expression, identify the components, and transform it to the admired circuit, it is a yes and no. If the student is able to create the table of relationship, express it in mathematical form, identify the electronic components and transform it to the admired circuit, is a yes. What the student was unable to do then is to simplify the expression, but at least is able to design and implement. That's a yes. Then if the student is able to create a table of relationship and express it in mathematical form or simplify again, but unable to identify the electronic components and design, is a yes but. If the student is unable to create a table of relationship, express in mathematical form, identify the components, and even unable to transform it to the admired circuit, is a no.
The assessment is how many marks? What marks are you giving to that question? 20, 40? You are, okay, it's 10. The whole question is 10 marks. Okay, the yes and more. How many marks will you give to that? You will give 10, complete 10 marks. Okay. Then the yes, how many marks will you give? 7 marks. Okay, the yes but you will give how many marks? 5. Okay. The no. God, you got it. So that we know, we don't just say yes, but then when it comes to allocating marks, then we start getting confused again. That is why I want us to. Because at the end of it, you are going to give numerical marks to this, not the. If you say yes and more, what marks are you thinking of? So that's how it is. Okay, you got it. Maybe you will become the teacher when we leave. Okay, all right. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. The standard is the student should be able to write a computer program to perform simple tasks. And the authentic task is develop a program, a computer program to calculate students' CGPA using Python programming language. Now, the criteria. I break this into 5 components. The first one, input. The student should be able to use appropriate and correct data types for all the inputs to the computer program. Then under processing, the student should be able to convert the inputs, which are scores, into grade points, and also should be able to convert grade points and use the appropriate method to generate the CGPA. Then output. The student should be able to put computer programming statements that we output the result of the program. And the 4th component I want to assess is the knowledge of the problem being solved. Then the last component under criteria is correct language syntax, because I said using Python programming language. So the rubric now for input, under input component, if the student is able to use appropriate data types for all the input to the program and is able to get the input correctly, as it is able to use the correct command to get the input from the user, then it's going to get yes and more. If it's just able to either get the input correctly, if it's able to use the correct data types for all the input to the program, then it's going to get yes. But yes, but if you get some of them and is unable to get the correct data types for others, that's going to be the yes, but, and it's going to be a no if for all the input to the program the data types are mismatched. Then for the processing, if it's able to convert the scores to grade points and is able to use the correct points for each of the grade points and get the what do you call it now? It is able to use the appropriate control structures. We are going to test like 4 points on that processing. Then it's going to get a yes and more if all those components are right. If it is 3 out of those, that is, if all those components are right and is able to move from processing to output correctly, then it's going to be yes and more. If it gets all the processing right, but it's unable to move from processing to output correctly, then it's going to be yes. And yes but means that it gets some of the processing right, but some are wrong, then a no will be wrong. The knowledge of the problem solved now. Okay, the output. If you get the correct output and is able to output it correctly.
Okay, thank you.
You have really tried.
Okay.
You have tried.
Okay, who else is in
That's
the
a very good attempt. Very, very good. Yes. Agric, you still want to go back?
Oh, you don't want to comment on this one?
Yeah, you see.
Yeah.